And it's about time we've discussed little red dots again, mostly focusing on this unusual mystery that's been unfolding since the early universe, and one that seems to fundamentally change our understanding of how early galaxies and black holes formed and evolved. And so, hello info person, this is Anton. Let's discuss some of the recent discoveries and actually somewhat intriguing discoveries from just the last few months, mostly focusing on this really bizarre mystery of little red dots. Something that you can see right here, and something that only started in 2022 when some of the first images from the James Webb started to be analyzed by astronomers around the planet. And even though here scientists expected to see familiar shapes, instead they discovered hundreds of these very tiny, extremely compact and intensely red points of light scattered across pretty much every single deep field image sent by the telescope. And that's essentially what we are now referring to as little red dots because, well, they appear to be little, they're extremely red, and they're dot-like in shape, with many of them appearing as early as 600 million years following the Big Bang, but then surprisingly disappearing approximately 1.5 billion years after it. And so for the past few years, the question has been, what exactly is this? What are these little red dots, and why do they not seem to exist anymore? And so far, the general consensus suggested that they're potentially extremely compact galaxies, maybe no more than 500 light-years in radius, or just a tiny fraction of the Milky Way. But for some reason, despite their small size, they're just ridiculously bright, with the redness coming from potentially two sources. First, the light has to be stretched by the expansion of the universe, a process called redshift, which for example makes blue light become red over time. But second, they also seem to be shrouded by an extremely dense layer of dust or gas, which also very often produces very large red galaxies that astronomers have studied for many years. But for the past few years, the big debate has been whether these are stellar-only galaxies, meaning that they're just packed with an impossible number of stars extremely close to one another, or, in contrast, if they're actually powered by something a lot more exotic. Maybe some kind of a bizarre matter, or possibly just an extremely massive black hole surrounded by something else. For example, in one of the previous videos, we've discussed the proposition that maybe these are black hole stars. Really massive black holes surrounded by so much gas and so much dust that the gas and dust starts to glow, producing an almost star-like object in terms of brightness, but just thousands and thousands of times bigger than the sun. But in the last few months, based on additional observations, researchers actually have discovered certain hints that now provide us with a slightly better picture of what's happening here and what these objects potentially are. And that's because one of the main reasons the black hole proposition does not make a lot of sense is because we know that black holes do produce additional emissions. Normally, when a supermassive black hole starts to consume matter, it actually creates a disk of hot gas around itself, which then produces an entire spectrum of light, including very often very powerful UV emissions and of course X-rays. And actually very powerful X-rays visible from super far away. But for years now, little red dots remain extremely weak in their X-ray emissions, meaning that even our best X-ray telescopes like the Chandra Space Telescope could not see anything here. Which led scientists to propose that maybe little red dots might not be black holes, but once again just something more exotic. Exotic stars that maybe just don't exist anymore. And you can learn more about this supermassive star proposition in one of the previous videos in the description. And so what exactly was this? Could this actually be a supermassive star, millions times more massive than the Sun, existing for just a few thousand years? Or could this actually be a supermassive black hole surrounded by a lot of gas? And well, luckily, in the last few months, researchers finally started to connect the dots. The little red dots. Okay, no more puns, I promise. With the most important and probably the biggest discovery coming from this study released just a few weeks ago. And so here a team led by Raphael Hvidin at the Max Planck Institute announced the discovery of a unique object now referred to as 3D HST Aegis 12014, or more simply the X-ray dot. Because intriguingly, this is the first ever object that seems to resemble a little red dot when seen in the infrared light, but unlike other objects, also can be seen in the X-rays and is actually very bright in the X-rays. In other words, for the first time in history, we have a little red dot that's also an X-ray dot as well. And this is a groundbreaking discovery for anyone studying these objects. It essentially makes this single object a kind of a bridge astronomers have been looking for the past 4 years, with the leading explanation right now suggesting that this is basically a kind of a transition phase between the typical little red dot that's only visible in the infrared and something else these objects become once they start transforming. And this of course suggests that little red dots very likely involve black holes after all, or basically that little red dots might be black hole stars after all. And so in this scenario, a black hole is initially buried inside this very dense cocoon of gas that's so thick that it actually absorbs everything including X-rays, but gas that also re-emits a lot of this as red and infrared light. But eventually, as this gas dissipates and as the black hole becomes more visible, that's when the X-rays become apparent. And so here this X-ray dot seems to be a kind of a late stage version where the black holes started to blow holes in the cocoon. And this of course provides the strongest evidence we have that supermassive black holes are indeed at the heart of all of these objects. But obviously we still have no idea what these objects become. Intriguingly though, not so long ago, we've also discussed a really strange object that was discovered very close to the Milky Way galaxy that some researchers proposed could be a super ancient little red dot. You can learn about this in the video in the description. But this by itself also brings us to other discovery from April 2026 involving the object known as QSO-1. An object that's possibly a 50 million solar mass supermassive black hole located at a redshift of 7. And in this case, a team led by Roberto Maiolino discovered that this object seems to be inside a very pristine environment where there's basically no oxygen or even other heavy elements around it, and seems to involve just pristine hydrogen and helium. Which by itself is quite significant because heavy elements are only made inside stars, or basically they usually involve supernova. And because this object lacks these elements, it once again suggests that the black hole formed before the rest of the galaxy in this case, and seems to represent most of the mass in this object. So in a nutshell, this is a black hole surrounded by gas and potentially contains no stars or very few stars that have not enriched this object in any other elements yet, while also providing evidence for the idea known as direct collapse black hole model, or basically that black holes, instead of forming from exploding stars, possibly also form as a massive cloud of gas collapses directly into the black hole itself, usually involving objects with hundreds of thousands or even millions of solar masses in mass. And so instead of black holes being a byproduct of galactic development, they actually could be primary architects and might be responsible for shaping a lot of galaxies out there before they even formed. With all of this basically found inside this object. But then there is a question of, are all little red dots the same? Or basically, are they all actually these massive black holes surrounded by gas? And the answer seems to be maybe no. Because some of the earlier research also showed that 30% of these objects seem to show clumpy or even disturbed structures when viewed in different wavelengths such as the ultraviolet light. So as you can see here, it's not just a dot. And this potentially suggests that many of them might be the result of young galaxies colliding, which then funnels a lot of gas into the center, feeding the black hole and creating this dense red cocoon. With at least one study investigating a triple galaxy referred to as the Stingray, discovering a kind of a transitional little red dot, suggesting that galactic interactions and mergers might be the trigger that eventually produced this little red dot phase. Or at least this potentially happens in some cases. In other words, we're still not entirely sure how this is produced, and more importantly, what this ends up producing at the end. And this is actually why this particular research is kind of important. First, until the James Webb Space Telescope, we could never even imagine these objects would exist. And now that we've found them, they seem to represent a kind of a missing link in the cosmic history that just doesn't fit into the overall picture cosmological models created so far. And so understanding why they exist and how they're produced and what they eventually become is, of course, important for figuring out how the universe evolved in the last 13.8 billion years. But based on some of the recent research and some of the recent discoveries, the conclusion is that they are kind of diverse and do involve complex morphologies. And so they seem to be a part of a dynamic interacting system and potentially have a much more complex nature than just a black hole surrounded by gas. Although based on the timelines right now, whatever this is, it seems to be a very short-lived transition and seems to disappear pretty quickly. But still, the more important question is, so what do they become, and why do we actually not see anything very similar, or even remotely similar, close to us? I mean, they couldn't have just disappeared into nothingness. And while we do have a couple of studies here that potentially discover something else, allowing us to maybe speculate on what these objects become, with both studies involving objects much closer to us. And so first, in one study, researchers find two compact objects, or actually two compact galaxies, at a redshift of 0.71, or at a distance of 8.6 billion light-years. And these galaxies are notable because they contain extremely similar V-shaped emissions involving very blue color in the ultraviolet and very red color in the infrared, a signature that was always associated with little red dots. But we know that these are galaxies, and specifically dwarf galaxies, that seem to have a very low stellar mass, but also very massive central black holes. As a matter of fact, for both of these galaxies, the mass of a black hole is about 6 to even 60% of the entire galaxy. In comparison, for the Milky Way, that particular percentage is only 0.1%. And once again here, the X-ray emissions seem to be very low, implying that the black holes are covered in a lot of dense gas. And so discovering these two objects suggests that these are basically much closer analogs of the little red dots that very likely evolved over time and have now transitioned to resemble dwarf galaxies, but also implying that little red dots possibly evolved to become very specific dwarf galaxies with overmassive black holes in their centers, and more importantly implying that these objects are potentially kind of common, but are just a little bit more difficult to find because they don't have enough stars, and black holes remain relatively quiet as these galaxies don't contain a lot of gas. And that's actually very similar to that discovery from very close to the Milky Way that once again we've discussed in the video in the description, with additional studies concluding that these objects are potentially a kind of an unstable transition stage that possibly exists in certain galaxies containing overmassive black holes. And it was only the environment early on, in the first billion years, that seemed to contain so many of them, for reasons we still don't understand. And so whatever this is definitely rewriting a lot of ideas we've had about the evolution of galaxies, and of course the formation and evolution of massive black holes. Because even though we used to think that galaxies form first, little red dots seem to suggest otherwise. Black holes seem to come first here, with everything else growing around them. And some of these black holes becoming so massive that they actually kind of don't make sense. Which means that we'll definitely come back and discuss additional studies about this, because the mystery, despite being a little bit closer to being solved, still contains a lot of questions we cannot answer. And so as scientists gather more data with upcoming missions like the Square Kilometer Array, we might even find more objects that represent different stages of evolution that could possibly explain exactly what's happening and what all of these objects eventually become. But at least for now, as of April of 2026, all of the evidence points at the existence of these overmassive, ridiculously large black holes that seem to form very early, grow very rapidly inside these dense cocoons, and then become super quiet for billions of years, in some cases orbiting very close to typical galaxies. And so on that note, once we discover something else, we'll come back and talk about it in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.